people think that we do.
My understanding of what the maternal child health nurse's role is, I didn't have a great understanding of it either until I had my first son. They support you through the first 4 years of your children's life, which is incredibly important, particularly when challenges arise, that they're the first people that I contact. You know, Amy was able to kind of guide me through things that I didn't even know I could do, and just reiterating that you're doing the right job, you know, so am I doing the right thing, and just having that rapport and that continuity of care from Amy with having her with both boys just, you know, made those challenges look like they were this big compared to like this big in my head.
Coming to Coburg and having been here so long, I'm now on to second generation families. I will see one grandmother brought in a baby and said, Jenny, you saw Robert when he was a baby, and Robert's 32 years old with his baby.
So it's pretty exciting that Moreland is celebrating 100 years of maternal and child health this year. I guess it just shows how important this service is to the community and what the community gets out of it, that it's lasted this long. For someone like myself who is relatively new to maternal and child health, you know, it seems quite impressive, but I bet to the nurses who have been here quite a lot longer, it really must be a great achievement for them.
Detached house, unit, townhouse, apartment, terrace. Whatever you call it, your house is your home, and your home is Moreland. Like the rest of Melbourne, Moreland is growing. By 2036, we'll have 43,000 more residents living here, and we all need a place to live. That means we need 18,000 new homes and different types of homes to meet the needs of our increasingly diverse and changing community. We need well-designed, livable, environmentally friendly, accessible homes that suit the changing housing needs of our community. We need a range of housing that is affordable to all members of the community, so that living in Moreland is a choice open to everyone. And Council is working to deliver all of this. We're sensitive to the needs of our residents and how we want our suburbs to look. Council has rules that allow for apartment buildings to be located in our activity centres. But in our residential areas, we will ensure new housing respects the established height, heritage and character of our suburbs. We have expanded our team of officers to ensure new development delivers on important features like landscaping, privacy and environmental benefits. Moreland is changing and needs a diverse range of housing. Because we're a diverse community, some of us rent, some of us own. We have single people living in houses and families living in apartments. Into the future, we know we will need more smaller homes to cater for increasing numbers of small households. We need to cater for a range of people living in a range of different housing options. It's more than just housing we're planning for, it's the infrastructure that supports it. 5,000 new street trees every year, sustainable environmental practices, green open space and better shopping strips. We're also working to make it easier for you to find out information and let us know your views on new development. Moreland is our home, one community, proudly diverse. By 2036, it's estimated there'll be 43,000 more people living here in Moreland. And they're all going to need to move about. To walk, cycle, drive, bus, tram, train, use shared vehicles, and whatever technology emerges next. Smart, effective transport is vital. So Moreland Council has plans to help keep us moving now and into the future. Our road network is already congested and more cars will only make that worse. We need to limit the number of additional cars travelling and parking around our city if we want to keep our quality of life or make it better. Building wider or more roads isn't the answer. There just isn't land available without immense cost. The answer is in making other forms of transport more attractive, practical, accessible and available. We're lucky. Parts of Moreland are rich with transport options. In these areas, there are more opportunities to change the way we move around. And we're working to create even more transport options for everyone throughout Moreland. We're going to give more space to pedestrians and cyclists and work with the state government to improve public transport. We want residents who move into new housing that's close to public transport and shopping areas to bring fewer cars with them. We're encouraging this by allowing fewer spaces within these new buildings and continuing to limit access to on-street parking permits for these new residences. This will only happen in activity centres and not in other parts of the city. Parking restrictions already exist in many parts of the city, and we're going to extend these to better manage parking in and around our business and shopping areas. We don't want the sought-after parking in these areas taken up all day by just one car. We want to ensure the spaces can be used by multiple people visiting our shops, doing business, using our facilities, and spending time in cafes and restaurants. Of course, for some people and situations, car travel is a necessity. We're not stopping that. We're encouraging viable alternatives, because small changes can lead to big differences. That change starts with us. Victoria's population is growing, and Moreland is growing too. It's estimated that the Melbourne area will grow from 5 to 8 million people in the next few decades. They need to live somewhere. Some will choose to live here in Moreland. It's a great place to live. Moreland Council knows the challenges and opportunities that this increase in population brings. With 43,000 more people living here by 2036, there are important things to consider, plan for, and act on. Things like housing, transport, our open spaces, and managing the impacts of construction activity. 43,000 new people, or around 18,000 new households, means taller buildings or more buildings on existing blocks. This is not what many of us are used to, but lifestyles are changing and we need to adapt. We want to encourage these taller buildings to be located near public transport routes and where daily needs like shopping and community services are just a walk away. This way, more people won't mean lots more traffic and congestion. More flexible use of our industrial land can help too. Some land can change to accommodate new work and local jobs, and some can provide housing for more people. We are also looking at ways that some housing can remain more affordable. Council is actively buying property to improve and purchase new parks and open spaces for all residents to enjoy. This is about thoughtful planning for a great future for everyone. The things we love, the vibrant and thriving shopping areas, our great heritage areas, will still be here. But changes need to happen. We want to make sure that any development is of high quality and improves livability. So we're making decisions based on research, data, world's best practice, and consultation with the community. Together, we can continue to make Moreland a great place to live for our long-term residents, our new...
Good evening, councillors, and to our viewers live streaming tonight's meeting, and to those in the gallery this evening. My name is Councillor Anna Olivia Carley-Hannon, and I'm the Mayor of Moreland City Council and the chairperson for tonight's meeting. The meeting is for planning and related matters. It is my pleasure to welcome you. We are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. We wish to acknowledge them as the traditional custodians of these lands and waterways and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as to other First Nation communities who contribute to the life of this city. This council meeting is being recorded and web streamed live to Council's website and Facebook, and the recording will also be available on video on demand. Gallery attendees are advised that they will be recorded during this meeting. A reminder that as councillors, we will conduct ourselves in accordance with the Councillor Code of Conduct, which will be supported by the principles of leadership and good governance that secures public confidence in the office of councillor. Members of the gallery, in the event that there's an emergency or disruption, we may be required to take action to ensure your safety. Please follow the directions of council staff and security officers. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. In attendance this evening, we have Councillor Adam Pulford.
Good evening.
Councillor Angelica Panopoulos. Good evening. Councillor Helen Davidson.
Good evening.
Councillor Helen Pavlidis.
Hi, everyone.
Councillor James Conlon.
Good evening.
Councillor Lambros Tapanos,
Good evening.
Councillor Milad El Halabi,
Good evening.
Councillor Oscar Yildiz,
Good evening.
and Councillor Sue Bolton. And we have an apology from the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Mark Riley, who's on leave. I'll also introduce Narelle Jennings, who's our Group Manager for City Development and member of the Urban Planning team. There are no other apologies tonight, so I'll now move over to disclosures of conflict of interest. Councillors, does anyone have a conflict of interest to declare? No? Okay, before we move to a report for matters to consider, I will outline how this council planning and related matters meeting will run this evening. For the item in relation to the planning permit application, the relevant planner will introduce the report and the officer's recommendation. I will then give objectors the opportunity to make their submission. After that time, the applicant will be given an opportunity to speak. You are requested to present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please do not repeat what other speakers have said. If you're opposed to the planning application, would you please inform the meeting why you're opposed and then suggest an alternative approach? Please use this opportunity to focus on your concerns rather than matters of detail in the officer's report. Also note that there is 3 minutes per person, but as chairperson, I reserve my right to use my discretion. The first item that we are doing this evening is 5.16 Hope Street, Brunswick Planning Application, NPS 2010-427B. Again, does any councillor have a conflict of interest on this? No? Okay, I will move to Kylie Sullivan, our planning coordinator, to outline. Hope Street first. Do we want to do Wilson first? I don't mind.
Just a Wilson.
It's okay, we can just do Wilson. Are you ready with Wilson? Yeah, great. 5.2, 9 to 21 Wilson Avenue.
Wilson.
All right, I think I'm there. Fine, thank you. All right, thank you, Mayor. Let's get on to my. Yeah. All right, so this is an application at 9 to 21. Probably gone ahead of page, but 9 to 21 Wilson Avenue in Brunswick that is seeking to construct a mixed-use development of an 8-storey building. This is the second time this application has come before the Planning and Related Matters meeting. The first time was in October last year, where the application was refused by council. The applicant subsequently lodged an appeal with VCAT. Through the VCAT process, a compulsory conference was held last month, where the parties to the appeal have reached consent. The purpose of the terms of settlement is the subject of the meeting tonight. So the site is located within the Commercial 1 zone and it's affected by a number of overlays, most notably it's Schedule 18 to the Design and Development Overlay. The site is located within the Brunswick Activity Centre. Jumped on me again. Okay, the site is located within the Brunswick Activity Centre and which is in an area identified for significant housing growth. The site is also one where employment users are prioritised. Wilson Avenue is noted as a key pedestrian street given its links to Jewel Station. The site comprises 2 land parcels on to the south side of Wilson Avenue between Sydney Road and Jewel Station. The proposal is for an 8-storey building comprising shops and offices at ground level, some adaptable units at first floor that can be used for either living or working spaces, 89 apartments on the levels above basement parking for 73 cars and 164 bicycles. As outlined in the officer's report from October last year, this application was originally advertised and attracted 15 objections, raising several concerns, including traffic issues with the rear laneway and also with amenity impacts through overshadowing. The objectors are all dotted there in blue on that screen. At the October meeting last year, Council's Planning Unit recommended the application be supported based on its assessment on the merits of the application, and they're the items that were highlighted in that report. Council, however, issued an alternative motion to have notice of decision to refuse a planning permit issued based on the overshadowing impacts to the 3 properties to the south being unreasonably overshadowed, which is contrary to one of the design objectives of the design and development overlay. The ground of refusal there, which is saying the building will unreasonably overshadow residential dwellings at 317, 319 and 321 Barker Street for 3 to 4 hours at the equinox, which is considered to be contrary to the design objectives of Schedule 8M2 Clause 4302, which seeks to maintain reasonable amenity for residential properties within and adjacent to the activity centre. The applicant has subsequently lodged an appeal with the tribunal seeking to review of Council's decision to refuse the application. All parties previously notified, including objectors, were notified of the appeal, with only 3 statement of grounds actually being lodged. As part of the VCAT process, a compulsory conference was held on the 26th of February last month, where 2 of the objecting parties attended, being the owners of 319 and 3898 Barclay Street, and they're the properties that are highlighted in red dots on the screen. The applicant circulated a set of without prejudice plans at the compulsory conference. The without prejudice plans to the advertised plans offer to provide for an additional setback of 2200 millimetres incorporated on the 7th floor and an additional setback of 800 millimetres incorporated on the 8th floor in the southwest corner of the building. And that's those spaces there that are circled in red where those setbacks will be applied. The updated shadow diagrams were presented showing that the differences in overshadowing impacts from that as originally proposed over the properties at 317 to 323 in Barclay Street. Those shadow diagrams, I'll bring them up for you. So the red lines are showing what was advertised last year in terms of shadow impacts, and the blue section shows what the shadows will be based on these amended plans that have been offered at the compulsory conference. So there's some opening up of light on those spaces. Whilst the overshadowing impacts will still be experienced from the proposed development, the without prejudice amended plans do provide an improved outcome for the properties to the south. The properties to the appeal reviewed, the parties to the appeal reviewed the amended plans and have accepted the offer from the applicant for the increased setbacks. As the negotiations at the compulsory conference, the objecting parties requested that the developer upgrade the rear laneway as part of this development, to which Neo Metro have actually agreed. This means that the northern unmade section of the lane along its entire length will now be properly constructed. Having satisfied the concerns of the objecting parties, the applicant requested the council reword condition 3 to clarify what the developer would be responsible for in relation to the Wilson Avenue streetscape improvements, which will all depend on the delivery of the timing of the project from council. An updated set of draft conditions has been prepared in consultation with council's development engineers and urban design unit, addressing the terms of settlement of the compulsory conference, which all parties have signed consent to. Closing, it's recommended that council consents to the agreement reached by the parties to the appeal, noting The updated set of draft conditions has been accepted and signed by all parties through the compulsory conference process. The mediated proposal will improve the access to sunlight to the residential properties to the south. The rear lane will now be upgraded at the cost of the developer, and that the proposal has strong policy support with a high level of compliance with Clause 58, includes commercial floor space, will be environmentally sustainable, highly accessible, and provides a community benefit in the form of an affordable housing unit. The final point that needs to be made is that if council does not resolve to consent to the agreement reached by the parties, this application will proceed to a full merits hearing where the mediated outcomes can be withdrawn by the applicant, and other conditions of the draft permit may also be contested.
Thank you, Kylie. Is Cindy Caldera in the gallery and would you wish to speak now?
Evening, councillors. So I won't take you long. I wasn't able to attend the compulsory conference at ECAT because I was really sick, but I spoke to Lachlan beforehand and he probably was supportive of my broad objections and also suggested ECAT's probably not the best forum to talk about the issues that I would like to make. The main issue I wanted to present is I'm a resident at Jewel Station South, which is a Neo Metro development. I really love the place I live in. It's a fantastic build, great work by Neo Metro. So I've got no objections to developers per se. However, I'm a strong advocate for community and placemaking, and I brought along the brochure that sold me to the Neo Metro product. And if you read through it, it talks all about placemaking, community infrastructure, social infrastructure, and all that sort of stuff. I really like Brunswick. I've lived in Brunswick for 20 years plus. And I'm glad to finally own two developments or two properties, apartments in Brunswick. I have principally, I'm not objecting to the development. I do hope council, however, will advocate for infrastructure to be built or considered within this one that's coming up, 15 to 12 Wilson Avenue, because there's going to be more than 1,000 residents in that immediate precinct. So there's the development that I live in now, which is Jewel Station South. There's another one, there's two currently in progress, Jewel Station North on Union Street. There's another one that's just begun on the corner of Black and Wilson Avenue, and then there's this fourth one. They're all Neo Metro developments. I see this as a really good opportunity for council, Neo Metro, VicTrack to all come in and provide the funds needed to provide a community space and deliver what was promised in this book. Because I can't imagine there being any land available for council to build infrastructure after all this is done. So hence I'm advocating that you consider integrating this space into an existing development. I'm not sure what red tape that will involve. That's not my expertise, but I'll leave this with you. I've circled the words that speak to what I'm talking about.
Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you.
Do you mind just staying there a moment? I'll see if there's any questions.
Sure.
from councillors? Yeah, Councillor Bolton.
I think while that's not really something we're going to consider as part of the planning, I think it is great, and it is an issue when there are lots of developments. This is what the experience of docklands and fishermen's been like, you know, the people only thought about the community spaces later. But so it's great that you've come along. Unfortunately, in the development itself, we can't really consider that as a ground, but it's something we need to put forward to.
I'm fully aware of that, and I realise that.
Thank you, Cindy. Sorry, we just can't have back and forth discussion, but thank you. We'll now have the applicant speak. So if we can, if you can take your seat. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, Lachlan Sinclair on behalf of the applicant.
Good evening. So as Cindy mentioned, my name's Lachlan, I'm the Director of Near Metro. This application is it's a two-stage application, so it represents the fourth and fifth building for us in the Drill Station precinct. We are now, we've completed one building, we're now under construction with two, and there's obviously as part of this process, obviously leading up to the first decision from councillors, we had an extensive dialogue with the planning team to develop the draft conditions that are now tabled within the report. And as sort of part of what's been a kind of a long process within that precinct, developed quite what I think productive working relationship with the planning team, and got to a result in this draft permit that we're collectively happy with. As Kylie ran through, with the decision that was handed down in October of last year, a refusal was initially granted due to overshadowing of the three properties which are on the south-west of our subject property. Through kind of extensive analysis, we identified that we're really impacting those properties for a window of 3 to 3.5 hours. So we zoomed in on those properties and get a better understanding of what was happening within those three properties. One of them predominantly uses their space as parking, and then part of their open space was used for enjoyment, so we focused on improving that area. And then a neighbouring property is also underway with construction of a pretty comprehensive renovation and extension of their property, so we also kind of understood a little bit further what's happening on that subject site and worked with that neighbour. Obviously, as a result of that detailed analysis and consultation with the neighbouring property owners, we reached the other day, a month or so ago, and subsequently draft conditions were agreed. And then I suppose the really kind of final point was just in relation to kind of the civil and public groundwork. So we worked, one of the requests from the neighbouring property owners was an improvement to the rear laneway. So we worked with council and their traffic engineers and have a suite of conditions about us improving the laneway for its entirety from the Black Street entry up to the conclusion of it, which is the Drill Station building where Cindy lives. And then also just some refinement around the coordination of our works and the forthcoming public groundworks that council are undertaking on Wilson Avenue itself. There was an acknowledgement that when the first draft conditions were put forward to councillors in October, that those plans were still very much in concept phase, and there's obviously been subsequently design development since then, so we're able to kind of reach a much more kind of detailed, clearer output that addresses a number of potential.
Thank you, Lachlan. Are there any questions for the applicant? No? Okay, thank you. Councillors, do I have a motion? Councillor Bolton?
I'm happy to move the officer's recommendation.
Okay, and is there a second? Councillor Tapranos? Okay, Councillor Bolton, you may speak.
Well, speaking to the motion, which is the motion which appeared in the agenda, I think it is good that a negotiated outcome has come about as a result of the compulsory conference, but I am disappointed that the developer didn't agree to improve the overshadowing for the residents and force council and residents to have to go through the whole VCAT process, pay all this money to go through VCAT in order to have any improvements to the overshadowing. I think it was Councillor Davidson and myself who originally moved the motion to refuse the application. The developer could have put this forward last year before our planning and other related matters meeting. I still don't think it's good enough, but I'm not going to stand in the way of a negotiated settlement where some of the other parties, the residents who actually live in the area, have managed to force some concessions out of the developer. But these residents face substantial overshadowing in winter for long periods of the day. And I think it is really outrageous that the developer had to be dragged into, giving any kind of consideration to these residents. So I'm glad there has been some sort of settlement reached, but I am disappointed that it took a VCAT case to extract some just small concessions in, for amenity, because I think access to daylight and sunlight is a really important thing, and people have really rediscovered that during our COVID lockdown year. So I'm happy to move the report and the council's position, but I'm not particularly happy with the actions of the developer.
Thank you, Councillor Bolton. Councillor Tapranos?
I'll be brief, but like Councillor Bolton, I too share some concerns about this development, but at the end of the day, I think it's a development that should be supported, and it's great to see that the objectors and the developer have actually come together to work out what is effectively a compromise. I do think there are significant additional benefits in this current proposal compared to what was originally proposed, but we are seeing an area that is under our strategies and plans due to be turned over and redeveloped. For me, I voted against the first building that the objector lives in. I thought it was too high. But I guess this now sets a bit of a precedent for the remaining of the buildings. So when you have a look at this built form, it's consistent with those kind of heights. It's got good ESD and it's got some good design features. And there's no real reason why it shouldn't be allowed to proceed. It should be supported.
Thank you, Councillor Tapranos. Are there any councillors against the motion? No, then I'll put it to the vote. All those in favour? Against? I declare that carried. I'll now get back to the to Kylie, to the officer, to outline the next steps.
Okay, so the positive outcome, council has decided to support the consent order as outlined in the heads of agreement dated 28th of February 2021 through the tribunal's compulsory conference process. In accordance with the heads of agreement, confirmation will be provided to the tribunal on Friday this week, informing that the agreement stands. Upon receipt of the consent from council, the tribunal will prepare an order to grant a planning permit, subject to the conditions as outlined in the terms of the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, now I'll just move back to the confirmation of minutes of the previous meeting. If I have a mover for those minutes, Councillor Tapranos, seconded by Councillor Pavlidis. All those in favour? Against? Declare that carried. And now we'll move to the second item for this evening, which is 6 Hope Street, Brunswick. And I'll ask Kylie to return to outline that project.
On the same page. Beautiful. I'll leave the notes. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so this is an application at 6 Hope Street in Brunswick that is seeking approval to allow the existing building, originally approved for student accommodation, to be also used as a residential village. This site is within the Commercial 1 zone and affected by a few overlays, most notably Schedule 18 of the Design and Development Overlay. The site is located within the Brunswick Activity Centre, which is an area identified for significant housing growth. The site has a narrow frontage to Hope Street and connects to Little Bree Street at its rear. Being located approximately 60 metres to the west of Sydney Road, the site also enjoys excellent access to services and public transport. The permit originally granted in 2011 approved the now constructed 5-storey building comprising 22 single-bedroom student apartments, ground floor shop and a full waiver of the car parking requirement. Being dedicated to student housing, Council approved the car parking waiver subject to the provision of 22 bicycle spaces being provided on site, one for each unit. As part of the approval of this development, a condition of the permit required the owner to enter into a Section 173 agreement prior to the building being occupied, which restricted the use of the building to being for student accommodation. The reason for this was that the apartments did not meet minimum standards in terms of internal amenity that would normally be applied to apartment development. However, as student accommodation is not usually long-term, the level of amenity provided for was deemed reasonable on this basis. This agreement was prepared, however, it did not get registered onto the title. The building has been occupied by students attending tertiary institutions in the area since 2012 and remains under the ownership of the same proprietor throughout that time. Last year, Council received a complaint advising that the apartments within the building were being offered up for rent to anyone, not just students. The owner was contacted and advised that they were in breach of the planning permit. The owner explained that the student housing market had been significantly impacted by the pandemic, with international borders being closed and the building as a result was largely unoccupied. In order to bring in the necessary revenue to run the building, the apartments need to be let out to other tenants. To ensure that the permit is not breached, the owner has lodged an application to amend the permit, which is the subject of the matter tonight. The amendment to the permit is seeking to allow the building to be used as a residential village in addition to a student accommodation. As defined in the Moreland Planning Scheme, a residential village is land in one ownership containing a combination, a number of dwellings used to provide permanent accommodation, residential village, and which will include communal, recreational, medical facilities for residents in the village. The building as originally approved meets the requirements of this definition, with the communal room and balcony area located on the 5th floor, which is circled in yellow on the screen. The residential village is a Section 1 use, which is as of right within the Commercial 1 zone. Therefore, a planning approval is not actually required for this use type. However, with any new use application, car parking requirements in the planning scheme must be attended to for that particular use. As there is no ability for this site to provide car parking for the proposed residential village, a full waiver of the car parking needs to be sought. Further to this, as this permit was originally approved specifically for student accommodation, an assessment of this amendment application must also consider the proposed building and its appropriateness for this new use type, as was similarly done for the student accommodation use proposed in 2011. Notification of the proposed change of use amendment was undertaken last year with 5 submissions being made, concerns raised, parking issues, proposed use, noise concerns, buildings and works, and also a removal of the Section 173. A planning information and discussion meeting was held earlier this month. However, no objectors actually attended. The meeting was used to help clarify some matters for the 3 attending councillors. The international border restrictions have had a significant impact on many industries, including the international student market. which has had the follow-on effect of impacting landlords who actually own buildings for student accommodation. It is reasonable, therefore, to allow flexibility in how buildings are designed and approved for student accommodation and how they could be used and how they are used during a pandemic, so that these buildings are not left vacant when they could be used as affordable housing to other people. Whilst the amenity of these apartments is not ideal in terms of access to daylight, which is currently borrowed from the adjoining undeveloped site to the east, the minimal balcony spaces these apartments can provide will provide good housing. The other people will provide good housing to other people until the student housing market returns. It is not anticipated that a development will be able to be constructed on the adjoining site for at least a 3-year period. Therefore, the access to daylight will be maintained for the short term. It is also anticipated that international borders should open up in 2 to 3 years' time, noting the rollout of the vaccinations that are occurring around the world currently. Therefore, a sunset clause has been determined to be the best course of action to account for the situation, to allow for the residential village use to occur for a period of 3 years. However, at that time, the primary use of the building as a student accommodation will need to be fully reinstated. And in closing, what's recommended is that a notice of decision to grant a planning permit be issued, with the key factors being that a sunset clause limiting that new use to being for 3 years, and the retention of the student accommodation use being rolled out after that time frame, and that a Section 173 agreement actually be put in place within a 6-month period of this permit being granted.
Thank you, Kylie. Nick Dolby, if you'd wish to speak.
Mayor, councillors, staff, I have a couple of concerns about this process. One, I don't have concern about converting student accommodation to residential village. I think, look, housing is housing, it's a good thing. I do have a concern over the Section 173 agreement, however. It's unusual that it was drafted and not executed. I'm wondering, are there more Section 173 agreements out there that have this problem? Why did that happen? Are there more? The other thing is that are there current residents in the building, and how will this process affect those current residents? Two concerns.
Okay, I'll pass to the officer, Narelle, to answer what she can.
Questions through the Mayor. In terms of the Section 173 agreement not being finalised, I'm not certain in this instance why that occurred, but what I can say is that probably in the last 6 or 7 years we've developed very good systems where we have Section 173 agreements on a register, and we regularly follow up to ensure that they're not missed. So we have systems in place now to ensure that that doesn't occur. And in terms of your other question, part of the consideration of the recommendation for 3 years was to allow a period of time, say 2 years, for it to be used as this use, and then a period of time for notice to be given to those tenants to give them some time to find other accommodation.
I'll now invite the applicant, Henry Johnson.
Good evening, councillors. My name is Henry Johnston and I'm a senior planner from Ratio Consultants, and I'm here acting on behalf of the permanent applicant for the land at 6 Hope Street in Brunswick. This proposal, it relates to an application to amend an existing planning permit in order to replace the current use of the building as student accom to a residential village. This will allow the existing building to be used as another form of residential accommodation in order to assist in mitigating the economic impacts of COVID-19. Significantly, we note that there aren't any buildings and works proposed as part of this application, and also the units will remain under one ownership, which will ensure that these individual units will not be sold off privately. It's also intended that the units will be used for affordable housing purposes, noting this is in response to the identified need and shortfall of affordable housing within the area. It's intended that the units will be occupied on the basis of affordable housing rates. They would reflect the existing market conditions. The approved development, it was constructed back in 2013 as a consequence of the outbreak of COVID-19 and the associated closure of international travel and borders. The building has held a very high vacancy rate. This has led to issues surrounding the immediate management and long-term viability of the building for the originally approved student accommodation land use. And therefore, these changes are required in order to be able to accommodate a wider range of persons to lease out the currently vacant units. In terms of traffic, the application was referred to Council's internal traffic experts, and they confirmed that they support the proposed waiver of car parking for the new use. But importantly, we note the proposed scheme will retain the 22 bicycle parking spaces on site, and that's in excess of the statutory requirements. And this, when combined with the site's excellent access to public transport, this is considered to result in a positive, sustainable outcome that will encourage the use of sustainable methods of transport. Following Council's initial assessment of the application, concern was raised around the potential for some residents to use the land as a permanent form of accommodation. In response to this, the permit applicant has agreed to a sunset clause condition on the permit, which will restrict the length of time the residential village is allowed to operate, and has also agreed to the Section 173 agreement being amended to also reflect this. We understand that the acceptance of these requirements has provided Council with the assurance needed to be able to support the planning application. One item that the client has respectfully requested that you consider tonight is to amend the sunset clause to a period of 5 years and the associated 173 agreement. That's in light of the envisaged long-term impacts of COVID-19 and the forecast return date for international students in Melbourne is envisaged to being 5 years. That's based on a student housing conference that he attended earlier in the year, and they were forecasting at around that 5-year mark. Now, based on the application demonstrating a high degree of compliance with the relevant provisions of the Moreland Planning Scheme, and more importantly, the significant economic impacts associated with the downturn in the student accommodation market, we respectfully request that you support this application. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
I've got a couple of questions, Mayor.
Yeah, Councillor Conlon.
Thank you for that. So you said that the applicant is committed to providing affordable housing into the development. Is the applicant willing to incorporate that commitment into a condition of the permit, including a definition of affordable housing?
Yeah, if there was an appropriately worded condition that we could form up, the client would be able to accept.
Are there any other questions?
So I did have one more. And then, so the applicant originally applied to convert the student accommodation complex into a residential village indefinitely or permanently, and it was a result of the officer recommendation that sunset clause be instituted. Do you have any sense if the applicant will be reapplying for the ongoing use of this complex as a residential village at the conclusion of the sunset clause?
No, the purpose is purely to get through the current economic situation, obviously impacted on by COVID. And once that's passed and the student accom market is back in full swing in Melbourne, he's intending to continue leasing those rooms out for the purposes of student accommodation.
Councillor Pavlidis.
Just a quick one. The previous speaker asked a question as well. Are there any residents currently on the premises, and if so, how many?
I'm not privy to that. I know, based on my discussions with the client, that he's said it's got a high vacancy rate, but I'm sorry I couldn't tell you how many exactly are currently in there. Look, I'd say none based on the current. It was purely international students that were currently in there.
Are there any other councillors' questions? No? Okay, thank you very much, Henry. Is councillor with a motion they'd like to move? Councillor Conlon to move, and Councillor Bolton will be the seconder, I believe. Once we hear.
Well, I don't know.
I will be moving Councillor Bolton's alternative recommendation, or which has been circulated already for refusal.
Yeah.
So do I talk to that now? Or? Yep.
Yes.
So I think this application has much bigger implications than what appears on the surface. So Brunswick has lots of student accommodation along Lygon Street and Sydney Road due to the close proximity of universities. And as the international student market dries up due to closed borders, as we've heard, these buildings are likely to become empty at some point. So the bigger question here is, what are councils across Melbourne going to do with their vast swathes of student accommodation in the context of a stalled international student market? We know that student apartments are built to notoriously low standards due to loopholes in the planning system. So the question is, are we prepared to convert our existing substandard student accommodation in Moreland into longer-term normal residential apartments? To me, this is a slope towards creating dog box apartments by stealth. If we say yes tonight, we'll create a dangerous precedent for ourselves to approve more of these types of applications. While officers have recommended a sunset clause for this particular application, if we convert the rest of our student apartments to residential villages, even just temporarily, it's going to be very difficult to undo this as the sunset clauses expire in a few years. So the political pressure on us as councillors to keep these apartments as residential will be huge, with so many more vested interests in keeping them that way. So I suggest we nip this in the bud tonight by voting for refusal. So the question therefore remains, if we refuse, what do we do with all these empty student buildings? So the state government's currently embarking on a $5.3 billion social housing program. Instead of building new buildings everywhere, it could simply buy up existing buildings made redundant by the pandemic, such as student accommodation, and repurpose them for social, affordable and public housing. They could then, these buildings could then be used for homeless people, victims of domestic violence or other crisis accommodation. The possibilities are really endless. So I think we shouldn't say yes to this application tonight just because it's easier. We need to think about the bigger long-term implications of tonight's decision.
Thank you, Councillor Conlon. Councillor Bolton.
Yes, I think this is a very problematic development, and in particular, it is relying on borrowed sunlight, which I think most people wouldn't even know you could do that sort of concept, from a private car park that's likely to be developed, which has got an expired planning permit on it. I mean, in my mind, such a development shouldn't even be approved for student accommodation, actually. Like, students have a right to sunlight, should have a right to sunlight, but we can't debate that because there's already a permit, the building's been built, so we can't debate that tonight. But the officer's report recognises that this is unsuitable for permanent accommodation. And the refusal, just to read out some bits of it, for people who haven't seen this, haven't seen what's been up on the screen, the proposed residential village use is contrary to clause 65 of the Moreland Planning Scheme in regard to the orderly planning of the area, as the existing building is not suitable for permanent accommodation or ongoing dwelling use for the following shortcomings: and insufficient internal amenity and access to daylight, insufficient secluded private open space, insufficient provision of storage, insufficient protection of residents from external noise sources, insufficient provision of communal recreation, insufficient car parking. But I think the critical, I mean, probably not the only critical thing, but really critical thing in my mind is the lack of access to sunlight if a building is built beside these units. And as Councillor Conlon pointed out, what we see, I mean, we see this with building heights as well. You know, one gets some sort of, lenient treatment, and so the building height goes up and up and up, and that becomes a precedent. This is likely to be the case with these sorts of dwellings, and I think, probably the state government needs to resolve, what should happen. I mean, it's not council's fault that the developer chose to build a building which was substandard for permanent accommodation because they're trying to make a quick buck out of the student market, which, don't like referring to students as a market anyway. So this has terrible amenity. I think humans have a right to sunlight. And if a building goes up next door, those residents or international students will not have a right to sunlight. So I just think, and this points to a weakness in the state planning scheme where there should be minimum standards for these sorts of things for students as well as other people. Otherwise, we end up in this, thin edge of the wedge, or you open the door, half a centimetre and they take a kilometre.
Councillor Bolton, if you can wait. Thank you. Are there any speakers against the motion? Councillor Tapanos.
I rise to speak against the motion. Mayor and Council, certainly the last year has been a very tough one for our community with COVID-19, and we as a council talk about supporting our community, particularly in the fields of housing. Certainly I'm listening to the discussion that's had by the mover and the second, and I must say that there's a little bit of a contradiction and a little bit of things that I'm not sure how they are relevant to this discussion tonight. I do agree that student housing in many respects is substandard, which is the word that was used. And I will be the first councillor to say that in our strategic planning, we should remove it. It is not a loophole, as has been referred. It is something that this council many years ago has embedded in its planning scheme. It exists in our planning scheme. I'll be the first councillor to say we should review that and possibly remove it because it's not the type of developments we want in our city. However, this building is built. It is built and it has a permit for student housing. So those issues in regards to sunlight and stuff, they should have been considered at that point when the permit was granted. I don't think it's a relevant discussion tonight. In regards to the mover's comments, that the solution here is that the state government buys these for permanent occupation. Well, that is quite contrary to our policy, and the whole officer's recommendation is, and the ethos of student accommodation is that it might be substandard because it's allowed for a temporary period of time, a year or two, not for permanent. So to suggest that the solution is that the state government use it for affordable housing permanently is a really unacceptable solution. So the answer that the mover proposed, or the question that the mover proposed is still valid. What do we do? And the sad reality is that nothing. They just stay vacant if we reject this tonight. So I am foreshadowing the officer's recommendation to allow a sunset clause of 3 years and grant this permit. For me, we are in a housing crisis. To do nothing and allow a whole bunch of dwellings to be unoccupied because the student market is non-existent, that's not debated. We know the student market is non-existent, and it won't be for at least 3, maybe more. But to do nothing and just allow houses to sit there vacant whilst there's a housing crisis, I think is letting our community down. We talk about affordable housing. We talk about how important it is to our community. Yet here is the proof in the pudding is how councillors vote. You have a dwelling there that is sitting vacant that could be populated with people who need housing desperately in affordable housing rates for only 3 years, which is an acceptable outcome. Or the best outcome in the very difficult scenario that we have. And for this council to say no to that is basically saying no to people accessing affordable housing, in my view. For me, there is no great solution here, but allowing vacant buildings and no solution at all is doing our community great harm. Whether it's 5 years or 3 could be debated. I think 5 years is probably more realistic.
Councillor
But 3
Tapanos,
years is
up,
certainly the
please.
least amount that could make this work.
Thank you. I'll just ask for a speaker in favour of the motion. There's a speaker in favour. Yes, in favour or against first. Is there any speakers in favour? Okay, Councillor Yildiz speaking against. Yeah.
Look, I appreciate Councillor Coleman's comments, and I think he does make a very good comment in the fact that he's saying this may set a precedent for any future student accommodation that may come to us and go, well, hang on, I've got a similar problem. What are you going to do about it? The thing that I attended the briefing with Councillor Pavlidis, and some of the key things that came out of that briefing were this. The owner, I don't know the owner personally, I've never met him, but one thing that came out clear is that this guy has a family. Him and his father, his entire family have invested a lot of money into this development. Their intention was always to have it as student accommodation. Something that's out of their control and out of our control has pretty much destroyed their lives financially. They've got a vacant property that's just sitting there. And yeah, you can argue and say, well, hang on, as councillors, we can't use empathy to make decisions. No, yes, we can, and we must, and we should, especially when it comes to these situations. COVID has had a massive impact on so many businesses, but also developers. People keep saying, yeah, developers are doing well. Well, actually, you might think they are, but some aren't. But this was a development that this family pumped a lot of money into. And for us to turn around and say, well, in spite of what's going on with the shortage of housing, with affordable housing, this development is minutes away from public transport. To put people in this accommodation or in these premises that can afford it, isn't that what we should be doing as a council? We can't allow such accommodation to be vacant. 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. You know what? We need to give this family as long as it takes for them to get them back into the financial red to be able to actually function, because they're not. And from what we heard, Councillor Pavlidis and I, in the briefing, was that they're finding it tough. And I think the architect or the gentleman representing, sorry, not the architect, the gentleman representing the family, I don't think he placed a lot of emphasis on the empathetic nature of what the family's going through. And I'd like us to please have a think about what they are going through. It's something that's out of their control, and I think we need to be supporting the 3 years at least.
Thank you, Councillor Yildiz. Are there any other councillors that wish to speak? No. Councillor Conlon, did you wish to close the debate?
Yeah, so, I mean, the argument that... so when this was originally approved, it was approved as student accommodation. And the reason that we've approved that is because there's loopholes in the planning scheme around the definition of student accommodation. And that's why we're seeing these below standard apartments being built across the city. So I don't think the answer is to just simply allow people to live in substandard accommodation because, you know, we can't find further accommodation for them. We can find that because the state government is embarking on this massive social housing problem. So I'm suggesting a smarter and more efficient use of existing resources by repurposing existing buildings to be used for the very purpose of what the state government is committed to, which is providing social and affordable housing. So I think that, these are political problems that need solving. They're not policy problems. So I think we should still refuse it.
Thank you, Councillor Conlon. I'll now put that to the vote. All those in favour? Against? I declare that lost.
Well, I stand to move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Tapinos. Councillor Yildiz as a seconder.
I'd like to propose an amendment.
An amendment? Yep.
So as I said, as I asked the developer, the developer's representative, that he'd be willing to accept affordable housing into this development. So I've got a proposed amendment to include into the planning permit, which is that all apartments in the residential village or in the apartment complex be rented out at affordable rates as defined as 50% below the median rental price in Brunswick.
Councillor Tapinos, is that acceptable?
I'm not sure if that's a definition of affordable housing, but...
I'm open to it.
I think it would be...
I'll take that as a no. We're going to have debate after. Okay. Councillor Panopoulos is to second that amendment. We'll debate the amendment now. So, Councillor Conlon, did you wish to speak?
Yeah, so I can email it around. I'm happy to workshop it, like I have come up with it on.
That's okay. I'm happy enough with it, but I'd just like to see it.
And I acknowledge Councillor Tapanos's point that 50% of the Brunswick median is probably technically not defined as affordable. So I'm happy to go lower if that's acceptable to Councillor Tapanos. But given that the applicant's representative did say that he was prepared to incorporate affordable housing into the complex, I'm proposing an amendment to make that a concrete commitment so that we can actually see this complex be converted into accommodation for people on low incomes. That's what I'd like to see out of this, and we've all given a commitment to that outcome in this debate. So I'd like to propose that an amendment that actually gets us to that outcome.
Yep. Thank you, Councillor Conlon. One moment, Narelle has a suggestion for us about where it could fit, and then I'll take your...
Just a suggestion in terms of the validity of a condition. I'd suggest that it be included in condition 17, which is the condition requiring the Section 173 agreement. And 17 Part A could reference that the dwellings be used for affordable housing as defined by the Planning and Environment Act.
Okay. Councillor Davison, did you have a question?
I think that answers my question. My question was more so, can we enforce the rental payment through the Planning Environment Act? And is that correct that we can?
So it would be very difficult through a planning permit condition, a standalone condition, but if it's included in a Section 173 agreement, then it's enforceable.
Right. Thank you.
Councillor Panopoulos.
Yes, so I'd like to speak in favour of the amendment that was proposed, and purely because within the agenda that was circulated to us, the buzzwords affordable housing were listed a couple of times, and the developer's representative had said affordable housing, we'll be able to provide affordable housing, and it's just about making sure that that's actually done, because we did see previously with the Section 173 agreement that was breached in the past, and so whilst words are lovely, I'd like to make sure that it is concrete and that we can actually get some real benefit for our community that do need this sort of thing, even if the standards used to build the building in the very first place are not exactly ideal. So.
Thank you, Councillor Panopoulos.
Can I just clarify what the amendment is?
Yes. Did you need us to read it out, or you wanted Councillor Conlon to...
Is the amendment what's on the board, which was the recommendation from the officer, or is the amendment as it was specified by Councillor Conlon?
So I'm going with, hang on, what's written on there. So hang on, that all apartments be, that all apartments be rented out at affordable rates in accordance with the definition, I think she's going to write, as outlined in the Planning and Environment Act.
It's the second one, right?
It's the second
Yeah.
one.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry, condition 17, yes, under the
I raise it because I don't have an issue with that amendment if that were to be incorporated.
So it should say all dwellings, not just dwellings.
Okay, we'll just keep... Great. We've got the amendment now, so we'll just keep debating it. So if there's any speakers against the amendment, then they can speak. Otherwise, we'll just vote on the amendment. Yep. All those in favour of the amendment? All those against? I declare that carried, and that's now part of the substantive. We'll now move to Councillor Tapanos, if you wanted to speak to the substantive. You haven't yet.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, look, I would be brief because we spoke at length previously. Just to say that by its nature, this will also just be an affordable housing dwelling, but I'm glad that that amendment was put in there. I do agree with the definitions that are known and in the Planning and Environment Act. I think that the definitions that were attempted to be put through were unacceptable. But at the end of the day, look, even 3 years may not be enough. we do hope that the student market will pick up. It is not just COVID that has an impact on the student market, but there's a whole range of other things that are occurring in the international student space, which is making it very difficult and decreasing the amount of students coming to Australia. And that includes things like Zoom and people being able to study online and various other aspects as well. For me, what this will do is it will give some certainty to people renting in this complex, although there's a sunset clause and it will revert back to student accommodation when the student accommodation market picks up. So I think it should be supported. I hope that we're not back here in 3 years' time, but I'm certain that if we are, it's because the market hasn't picked up, and perhaps 5 years would have been something that should have been considered. But considering the debate around the chamber, I think 3 years is an adequate sort of number, and they're happy to support the officer's recommendation and reasoning behind that figure.
Thank you, Councillor Tapanos.
There's a word missing. So the word all in front of dwellings is missing. That all the dwellings.
In the red part. Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Bolton. Councillor Eulis waives his speaking rights. Are there any speakers against the motion? No? Then I'll put it to a vote. All those in favour? Against? I declare that carried. I'll now pass it to our officer, Kylie, for the next steps. Once you're ready.
So the council has decided to issue a notice of decision to grant an amended planning permit for MPS 2010-427B. It's to be issued for the construction and use of a 5-storey building that contains a residential building, student accommodation and a residential village, a shop, associated flood signage, a waiver of the standard car parking requirements at 6 Hope Street in Brunswick, subject to the conditions in the officer's report, with one amendment to add a new condition requiring all dwellings to be rented out as affordable housing. So, following the issue of the notice of decision, both the applicant and any objecting parties will receive a copy of the notice of decision to grant a planning permit. Objectors will have 28 days to appeal council's decision at the Victorian Civil Administrative Tribunal. In the event that no appeal is lodged at VCAT, a planning permit will be issued. If a permit is issued, the applicant has 60 days from the date of issue of the notice of decision to appeal any of those conditions.
Thank you. Councillors, that concludes the items on the agenda for this evening. So I'll now close the meeting at 7:38 p.m. Thank you all for attending.